My name is Mike Fox, and I'm here with Emmett Pagan, who is our videographer, and we're here on behalf of the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania History Project. Today's date is, what's today's date?
The 13th.
March 13th, 2019. And we're here for an oral history interview with Carl Bechdel. This interview is taking place at his home in Harrisburg. Do we have your permission to record this interview today?
Yes.
We have a consent form for you to read over and sign at the end of the interview. So easy stuff first. Please say and spell your full name.
Carl Bechdel. That's C-A-R-L-B-E-C-H-D-E-L.
So what's your date of birth?
January 30th, 1954.
1954. And where were you born?
Bellefonte, Pennsylvania.
Bellefonte. Where's that located?
Just north of State College, where Penn State is, which is where I grew up.
So can you tell us about your family of origin?
They were in State College forever. My father's family was there in 1767, and my mother's family was there sometime before 1802. And needless to say, there were generations of Penn Staters, and so I grew up in State College, went to State College High School, and from there I went to Penn State because I was like 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th grades.
What did you study at Penn State?
I started out in liberal arts and then quickly decided I didn't like liberal arts because it didn't seem to have any practical application because I was planning to go to law school. So I decided to switch over to business, so I graduated from the School of Business and then went to law school.
Okay. Did you complete law school?
Yes.
Where'd you go to law school?
Dickinson School of Law.
Okay.
Which, back at that time, if Penn State had bought it and put it on the campus, I would have been thrilled. But when the time came that Penn State bought it, I was totally opposed to it because I knew how big and bureaucratic Penn State was, and I knew how well run the Dickinson School of Law was. So in my opinion, all they've done is mess it up over the years.
So what was your early schooling like, growing up in that area?
For me, it was sort of idyllic. You know, you would walk to school, you would walk home for lunch, you would walk back to school, and then you'd walk home again. Of course, you were doing this with your friends and whatnot, and you were walking like 2 blocks, and so you know, it was pretty great. And I just took it for granted, but it's sort of like everybody kind of knew who I was, even though I didn't know who they were, in the sense that the teachers and the administrators and all of that were parents that knew my parents or had gone to school with my parents, right down to the fact that the high school in State College was actually established by my great-grandfather. So
It sounds like a safe place to grow up.
yes, it was very comfortable, very easy, and I, of course, as any kid, just took it all very for granted.
Was religion a part of your life growing up?
It was more like learning how I was not religious. My family was not particularly, you go to church every week. When I was real small, probably because my parents thought one should take one's children to church, we went to church somewhat, and of course I really went to the Sunday school at that young age, and I remember even then thinking, I don't know what my mind was thinking in actuality, but the gist of it would be, what are these people smoking when they were telling me Bible stories? Because it's like, I just don't get it. You know, is this a metaphor, or did they expect me to believe this? And I was just disbelieving, but thinking, I'm supposed to. These are adults. They are supposed to know what they're talking about. Certainly, they wouldn't be just making this all up. And but then, after at that young age, we weren't going to church at all for a period of time. And over the years, I just got further and further away from churches until I reached the point where I don't want to knock religion, but I was not religious. I don't. If somebody asks me, are you religious, or are you agnostic, or are you atheist, I would say we have to define it. Because if you define God as literally from the Bible, then I'd say I'm an atheist. But if you define God as that unknown power that organized or runs the universe or whatever, I'd have to say I'm agnostic. Who knows the answer to that issue? So I'm somewhere between agnostic and atheist, I guess, and had not that much religious upbringing.
So you said you were questioning religion at a young age.
Oh, right from the beginning. I never bought into religion,
Just
really.
as early as you can
I
remember.
kept trying to buy into religion because, everything, which actually is an analogy almost to being gay, which everything was telling you this is what is right, good, and what you should be doing. And but it just never ever clicked with me.
So I'm interested. You mentioned you had these roots in your town. Where was it again?
State College.
State College, right? And you said your grandfather started the high school?
He was the superintendent of the county schools, and so he established the State College High School, which was like 1903, I believe.
Do you know what was his name?
That was David Edders.
David Edders.
Not that I never knew him. I didn't even know my grandfather. By the time I was born, both of my grandfathers were dead. I knew my grandmothers, but my last grandmother was dead when I was 11, and the other one I was only 7. So grandparents played a small part in my life.
Did they die young?
Well, by today's standards, maybe. My grandfather, my first one, died at 47. He worked at the university. He came home for lunch and then went back up to the university. He drove, even though it was only a few blocks, and parked his car, and as he was getting out of the car, he died. I believe it was an aneurysm. And he was caught in such a pose that a local campus cop who knew him came up and started talking to him before he realized there was something wrong. And so that was the end of him. Then my paternal grandfather died at 63 after suffering from a stroke he had 2 years earlier. Then my maternal grandmother died at 74, and my paternal grandmother died at 79. So at the age of 65, I'm starting to think, oh, I'm getting up there.
No. Is there any other, or what are some other interesting stories from your deep history in that area?
I don't know if I can judge interesting. A lot of it probably goes to State College roots, because one of the big national stories a number of years ago was the whole Joe Paterno scandal. Well, Joe Paterno lived at the next house down the street from us before he got married, when I was younger. And so I sort of knew Joe Paterno from the time I was quite young. And my father met him in 1950, so they knew him all the way along from the time he first came to town. And so the scandal was very sort of personal, and it's kind of bizarre to watch national news or see a movie or whatever on this whole thing and know intimately the whole thing. And it doesn't stop there, because the athletic director was Tim Curley, and Tim was in my class in high school, and I knew Tim quite well. And so that was sort of a bizarre experience to go through all of that and know just about everybody that was involved one way or the other.
It's bizarre. Yeah. So I guess I was going to ask, what was it like seeing your hometown, your people you knew portrayed that way?
In some ways, it's not shocking. It's just a little surprising when it's your hometown. I suppose, or your home, or your family, or your friends, or whatever the case may be. I think everybody probably has that reaction when they suddenly find themselves, not necessarily in the middle of, but at the scene of, you might say, some kind of national story. You always think those things happen to other people.
So it sounds like a very safe place to grow up. Sounds like you were like emotionally safe.
Yeah, when I left high school, actually, being an adolescent and all, it was like, okay, now I'm getting to go up to the university and I won't be in the high school where everybody knows my name kind of thing. And it is a big university. I got into line, because back then you got into lines to register. So I got into line to register. Very first class I'm registering for, I get into this line and I finally get up to the woman who's doing the registering for this course or whatever. And she looks at my name and she looks at me and she says, now, are you Mike's son or Wayne's son? Which is my uncle and my father. And so it's like, oh, I guess I haven't gotten very far at all. Which I recognize now is kind of silly to think that you could go, a mile in a different direction and expect to be in any different place, but somehow I did.
There was never any question you'd go to Penn State?
There was never any question. I mean, it was, like I said, it was just like going to 13th grade.
So what was it like, do you identify as gay?
Yes.
What was it like growing up gay there?
Wait, how much interviewing have you done?
This is my fourth one.
My time period growing up, which would be the 60s and then going into the 70s, up until maybe Stonewall, you would never have seen anything anywhere about homosexuality, period. It wasn't in TV, it wasn't in movies, it wasn't in the papers, it wasn't in magazines, it was nowhere. And I knew of no books even that contained anything on it. So I was totally oblivious. So you're left out there, but you're left with the impression that, first of all, it's wrong. And you're almost like, where the hell did that even come from? Because nobody really talks about it. You do have some language. People really didn't even use the term faggot back then, that I recall. At least maybe not around my precious little ears. But you did have an impression, or I had an impression, that you were effeminate if you were a homosexual. So even what the term meant would have been a little bit lost on me. But I knew that I was somewhat more attracted to the boys than to the girls, that this was not the way it was supposed to work. But then from there it was sort of like, well, will that change as I go older? Do I just need to focus on the right thing? That kind of thing. And so I just kind of meandered along. I'm very good at denial. So if I don't want to deal with something yet, I just take it and I put it over here and it really is out of mind. And I did that very successfully for a very long time. And then through the 70s when I was older, because I finished college even in 76, you started seeing and hearing more about this. And, but by the time AIDS came along, I was already married and had kids. And so then it was sort of like, I was starting to get what being gay was, but it was sort of like, well, hold it now. I've sort of made all these commitments and built a life. Now I would say I built a life on sand, but so don't I have a commitment here to carry out? So I went along for a few more years, and then it actually came to me like almost in an instant. It's sort of like, by the time I'd done everything career-wise that I sort of wanted to do, not that I was done by any means, but had achieved things, and had kids and a home and all of these things, so everything, all the big challenges sort of that I'd put a focus on out of the way, then one day it was like, oh my God, I'm gay. What the hell am I doing? And it came to me literally just about that fast, and just took my feet out from under me.
What was your age?
I was 34, and it was 1988. And actually, I think what triggered it was I went to a friend's wedding. And when I went there, what I didn't fully appreciate is that a friend of mine from high school was there, because it was his brother's wedding, and that friend was gay, and he was there with his boyfriend, whatever. And so there was a certain reality that hit me about that particular scenario. Now, it didn't really hit me there. It was like a day or two later, I was sitting at my desk in my office working, when all this kind of came back to me and started hitting me. And then it's like my brain just started going into some kind of like fast forward through the whole life, re-examining everything from a new perspective or something. I found it all very bizarre.
So it seems like you saw that people could live that way?
I don't even know if the word could, that it was more like did.
Did.
That there was a reality was finally connecting to all the stuff that I was ignoring for a very long time.
Did you have any gay people in your life up to that point?
No. Although it's funny because they can be right under your nose and you can ignore them. Although I'll point the fingers almost more at my parents than myself in this case, because across the street from us, the whole time I was growing up, was a lesbian couple. Nobody referred to them, thought of them as being a lesbian couple. And I can remember a number of years later, and they're still living across the street. And my father's still adjusting to this whole concept of gay and everything. I said, you know, you have a lesbian couple living across the street from you. And he was like, who? You know, just totally oblivious. Now, women seem to be able to get away with that more than men. Two women living together, and there's a certain misogyny, I think, that comes into this, because it's like, well, yes, if you're a single woman, you might want to live with another woman, you know, for security and protection or whatever. But if two guys were doing that, well, that's not normal. But that's how you can be oblivious to these things. In fact, my father had a friend, which I had learned was gay in town. So that's his generation even, and still very, very closeted. And, you know, I brought that up, and it was, once again, one of those shocking things. Although my father and mother both went through high school together. They were in the same class. They had known each other since, you know, they were like single digits. So they knew all the same people. And my mother was like, well, we always did say, and I forget what term she used, something like he was light in the loafers or something along those lines or something. You know that phrase?
No, I've never heard it.
You've never heard light in the loafers? Oh, yeah, that was one of those subtle ways of referring to somebody as being gay.
Do you have any idea what that would suggest?
I don't really know. I would guess it sort of creates an image of somebody who maybe pranced a little too much or something like that.
So you were 34 when you came out, when you realized you were gay, really. You didn't...
We started to deal with it, recognized it, started to deal with it. And in my typical fashion, it was like, okay, we're not going to take our time about this. We're going to do everything quick. And I kind of like put down a plan of action. It's like, okay, who do you need to tell first? And what are the next steps you do? And little did I realize, basically, I was like pulling the rug out from my own feet, so to speak. And it became very difficult for me because I became severely depressed and had to get myself a therapist to deal with everything and all of that kind of thing. Because I didn't realize how much of my identity I was like tugging and pulling away. I liked one thing my therapist said about it is that referring to the way that I can control myself and focus on what I wanted to focus on and not necessarily what I needed to focus on, it was sort of like, you know, if you take your emotions and you make them slaves, eventually one day the slaves will rise up and burn down the plantation. And that is sort of what happened to me.
How much of your life were you disrupting? You know, you said you were pulling the rug out from under yourself.
Well, a lot. I remember because I also then decided to make a few career changes. You know, first of all, the very time, 2 or 3 weeks before all this hit me, my wife told me she was pregnant. So I had the pregnancy to go through.
Is this your first?
No, this was the second to deal with. I always tell my daughter she just made it under the wire. Who, by the way, is a lesbian. So years later when she came out, which was not a big thing for me, I thought, you know, if I had not dealt with this earlier in life, and then suddenly I found myself with a lesbian daughter much later, you know, that could have been, God knows what kind of a disaster for me to deal with. But as it was very easy, and it was able to be supportive. In fact, it was also very interesting because then she had times being what they were, i.e. very, very different, where you could be very out. And she was out in high school. She brought a lot of her high school friends here, both male and female, who were all gay. And we were like this mecca for these young gay people. And it was very nice to know that you could give a positive image or role model or whatever to young people as they're coming up, rather than them having to deal with it when they're in their 30s. So things kind of come around. But I went off course there somewhere. I was talking about at the time. So I had to deal with the pregnancy, and then there was work. And things were kind of happening. My mistake was I was an attorney, but I went to work for banks. And one of my father's friends said to me when they learned I was going to the bank, they said, remember, the banks keep all the money in the vault, i.e. they don't pay well. Well, I wasn't too concerned about that. So, but the thing I didn't realize was I got into banks just as they were deregulating, which started all the mergers and acquisitions. And I was just now going through one of the big upheavals and all of that. And so it was like pulling me around because they wanted me to go here and be in this position or go there and be in that position. And so not only was my personal life kind of like being dissolved by me, but my professional life wasn't being dissolved, but it was being changed very dramatically. So I had all this change going on. I remember sitting down and one of these magazines, you know, test to determine whether you're at risk of depression or not. Well, at the time I was already depressed, but I took the test and there was like 20 questions. And it said, now if you check 8 of these as yes, that's me, you are at severe risk of having depression. Well, I checked 18 of the items on that list. It's like, oh God, no wonder I'm depressed. Because and a lot of it had to do with just changes or setbacks or whatever. And I had them just about all.
So you went from this stable, idyllic youth and developed into this place where everything was changing.
Yes, so that was hard.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So I'm thinking about your youth a bit. And you said that you knew you were attracted to younger guys. Or not.
They were younger, but they were my age.
That's what I meant to say. I'm sorry. You knew you were attracted to guys.
Yeah.
When you were younger. How did you make sense of that at the time?
I didn't.
You didn't?
That's the easy way to make sense of it. You just don't try to make sense of it. Because I had no framework against which to put it. And this is where I say the religion thing comes into play. Because it was sort of like when they were trying to tell me Bible stories, and I was going, that just doesn't make any sense. At the same time I was going, yes, but they're adults and they must know what they're talking about. So when I was thinking I'm attracted to guys, it was sort of like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And then it was sort of like, and looking around the world, well, it must not really be that real a thing because...
There's nowhere for you to fit in there.
Yeah, it just doesn't exist really. So it happens, is it a phase you go through, you know, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of that phase you go through. Unfortunately, nobody used that on me. When I came out to my parents were really good about it. You have to understand, my parents were very conservative in the old-fashioned sense of the word as opposed to...
Can you differentiate that for me?
Well, they were small-town white Americans who had very, very deep roots. So they were Republicans, as Republicans were before FDR. My parents grew up, well, I didn't grow up, but they were growing up during FDR with Republican surroundings and all of that. And so it was like Democrats are those other people kind of thing. Now, not that my parents were all that prejudiced or anything, but they were not, it was sort of the team mentality, but it was a very different team. I find, well, for example, at that time, the bigoted, racist, hateful people in the country were Democrats. They were Southern Democrats. Those are the same people that are leading the Republican Party today. There's been a complete realignment of the parties in the country. If you ever looked at electoral maps of electing the president, you would see that the Northeast, all the way down through Pennsylvania and everything, was solidly Republican. Election after election after election. And the South was solidly Democratic. Election after election after election. And the swing areas were like the West and maybe not even Midwest. That was pretty Republican too. If you look at the maps now, you'll find the whole thing is completely flipped. And that's because the people that made up those parties, not the same people, but their descendants and all, have completely flipped parties. So that's why I try to differentiate a little bit. My parents were sort of what are now Democrats, but they were Republicans back then. And but Republicans still were different than Democrats today. They were very conservative just in the sense of they did not like revolutionary change. They liked evolutionary change. But they weren't against change, and they weren't for rolling things backwards. And so the idea of sexual orientation was something that was just outside of their wheelbox entirely. So
Not part of the national discussion.
not part of the national discussion, not something that they had thoughts or feelings about really much one way or the other, except that their own prejudice was that, well, you know, that's not good. But not having this built-in antipathy, it's not like they were suddenly like, well, we've got to get you to some kind of help or whatever. Right after I had this realization that I was gay and had to deal with it, my mother called me up just about one thing or another, and while at the end of the conversation, and I shouldn't have put it quite this way, but at the time it seemed that way, I said, I have some bad news for you. And she goes, oh no, what is it? And I said, well, it's about my sexual orientation. I think I'm gay. And she said, oh, thank God that's all it is. I thought it had something to do with our finances because I handled their money. So, needless to say, that was somewhat reassuring that to her it wasn't that big a deal. But then she was like, well, we can't tell your father. I don't know how he could deal with this. So we didn't tell him for a while, but I said to her, well, I have to tell him because, you know, at that time my father was probably, what would he have been? Close to 60, but I don't even think 60 yet. So it's like, we're going to keep this secret for decades to come. And so one day I told him, and I forget what he said, but it was sort of like, I think it was along the lines, well, that's just the way you're made. And it was sort of end of story. But at the same time, I think he was like, oh God, how do I deal with this? But he didn't say any of that to me.
That's just a lovely reaction from your parents.
Yes. So once again, you know, the sort of the idyllic childhood and all of that kind of continued up through that. And my mother slowly, as she was getting used to it, was getting used to it in ways of, oh, and this is a sign of the times because by this point we're starting. I came out in '88, so we're moving on into the '90s and all that. Gay issues are getting to be everywhere and all that. In some ways, I think my mother started to find it being, oh, I'm kind of like on the in thing here. I have a gay son. So, and then she'd find that she had other friends who had gay children. And so, you know, there was sort of a bonding effect and she got used to it and got over it, you know, although it took some years. My father, I think it took a bit more male macho thing and all of that. And in my family, I had an older brother, a younger brother, and then a much younger sister. And in some ways, I think I was my father's favorite because State College, needless to say, is a very educated town. My families on both sides had been very educated for a very long time. My grandfather had a PhD in 1909. So my father came along, though, and he was not a good student. And he didn't get a college degree. He got a technical degree, and he was a heating, venting, air conditioning contractor. And he did very well, in part because he was so well connected with everybody in the town, and the town grew hugely. You know, the university went from 5,000 students when he started his business, and today it's like 45,000 students. So you had a huge amount of growth in town. So he did well, but at the same time, I think he had this inferiority complex about his education and all that. And I came along, and I was a very natural student, and I did very well in school. I did very well in college. I went on to law school, and had the career and all that. So whatever that was, I think in some ways I was the child that he liked to brag about, or whatever parents do.
You feel like that changed?
No, I don't think it did. It just, like I said, we had this sort of closeness. And so it is interesting because when my daughter came out to me even, I was very calm about it. It was sort of like, well, that's good to know. And inside I was going, oh my God! Because I don't know why it is, but you suddenly start creating a whole different picture of the person that is and the person that's going to be and this kind of thing. And when it's a child or somebody very close to you, you know, there's a lot of redefining that goes on with that. I'm lucky in some respects because maybe it was because it was inside me to begin with. But I always told people when my wife would be pregnant and they'd say, what do you want, a boy or a girl? I'd say, I really don't care. And I had a reasoning for that, which was if you go around saying you want a boy or you want a girl, and you may be very truthful about it, that's what you want, what you're really saying is I have this image in my head. I have this image of what a boy is going to mean, and I have an image of what a girl is going to mean. It's, you know, the football player and the cheerleader or whatever it is. You have very gender-related kind of things already built into that. That's why you have these preferences about it. You're not thinking, oh, I'll have a boy who will be gay and like the ballet. No, you're not thinking that at all. And so when I think you hear, so I never wanted to try to get into what gender. In fact, I remember years later, a child who was now a parent, but of my kids' generation, and they had children, and he had a daughter, and he was saying how he wanted to have a son because he wanted to have a soccer player in the family. And I was like, do you understand what you're saying? That a girl can't be a soccer player, and you're assuming that if the boy comes along, he's going to be a soccer player, and that you're not going to be subliminally, if not outright, telling the boy that you're putting pressure on him to be a soccer player? I mean, this is all bad to me. So I was always like, the kid will be who the kid will be, and...
So you were in your 30s when you had your first kid?
I was 28 when my son was born, and I was 34 when my daughter was born.
So there was a range there. So 28, and you had these forward-leaning perspectives on gender already in the 80s. Were you ahead? Do you feel like? Did you have contemporaries who felt the same way as you? Did you feel?
Yeah, I was always fortunate in a sense of having some very what's the word I want to use? Enlightened, elitist family and friends who helped me give a broader perspective just the whole way growing up. I only have 8 cousins, but most of them are fairly high-achieving individuals. And my friends all tended to be sort of the same ilk. So it was just it was more or less a natural environment for me. So, you know, you got challenged on everything all the time.
I see. So you had people who were already questioning everything, sort of. So
yeah, and keep in mind, you know, I was born in '54, so I was hitting puberty like at 66. And if you have any familiarity with the late '60s, everything was being questioned. That was the first time even that the gay issues came up, and that would have been like at Stonewall, which was '69. Now, you would have thought I could have caught on to some of this, but there was a lot going on. I don't know if you've ever studied 1968, but every month in 1968 was like a year any other time. You went from the Tet Offensive to Lyndon Johnson dropping out of the race, to the assassination of Martin Luther King, to, I forget, the riots that followed that, and the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, and the Chicago Convention and the riots there, and it was just one damn thing after another. And in 1968, to me, that all seemed very normal, because once again, I was 14 years old and I hadn't had that much perspective. So you get the next year, you know, I'm 15. Stonewall, I remember seeing something about it, but it was so, to me, buried under everything else that was going on, because the big news at that time was still the Vietnam War, and everything was tied into that. And of course, for me, I was somewhat a natural optimist. I wasn't going like, they've got to get this war over or they're going to draft me and send me over there. I never worried about that, because to me a year or two seemed like forever back then. You know, there was still, you were still getting body counts every week of 100, 200, 300 Americans being killed in Vietnam. It consumed the country.
did you have anybody that fought in the war?
My older cousin, Les, was a Army grunt. I mean, he wasn't just in the military in Vietnam. He was one of those who was right in the thick of the fighting over there. I remember he came back with malaria, and he was sitting on the back porch talking to us when he got home, and a thunderstorm kind of came in. And every time there was clap of thunder, you saw him visibly jump. And it was from his conditioning of incoming shells.
Did he ever recover from that kind of stuff?
Oh, yes. Les, before he went, had been what today would be called the Olympic, but it was like the American team of whitewater sports people. And he went into the business of whitewater, you know, tour guides and people and all that kind of stuff. And he worked for some people and then started his own business. And he also wrote what is still today the book on whitewater safety. And he lives out in Idaho, and now he's retired and he does part-time work as a forest ranger.
Cool. Is there whitewater in Idaho?
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's where he established his own business. It's the Snake River, I think.
Nice. You said you didn't get much of a perspective on Stonewall when it was happening. Do you remember anything or any vibes or feelings from that time about that issue?
No. In fact, it's even possible that I didn't hear about it at all. Because unfortunately now, which is 50 years later, my God, it's 50 years this year, I can't tell you whether my memories are contemporaneous or have been constructed out of hearing about it later.
Very self-aware. Okay. So, you've stayed in the area most of your life? Is that right?
Yeah, work has taken me around. You know, I really wanted to kind of stay in State College. I mean, who in their right mind wants to leave such an idyllic place? And I had such deep, deep roots there. But work first took me to Altoona, which is a place one should not want to really go to, but it was close to State College.
Why is that?
Because it's depressed. I mean, economically depressed. So, and you know, it's not in the middle of anything like New York or Chicago or LA or anything. So it's like, who wants to go to Altoona? But the work was good and wasn't too far from home.
You worked as a lawyer?
Yeah. And, but then, like I said, I was working for banks, and then the banks were dragging me around. And so for a short period, right when I came out, they popped me up to State College. And there I learned the expression, you can never go home again. Because the thing about State Colleges is basically everybody leaves, because it's got a deep but incredibly thin job market. Sort of, if you're not a college professor, there's not really anything here for you. Now that's a bit exaggerated, but for example, as a lawyer, well, there are tons of people who want to be in State College, so the town is already glutted with lawyers, so you're not going to do anything like that. But I was with the bank, so they brought me in, but then they wanted me down here, and that's how I came down here. They sort of dragged me down here, and then I met my husband Dan when I was down here. So
when did you meet?
1990. A friend of ours, who we just had dinner with last night, had a party, and I met Dan at the party. And I didn't even know the guy who was running the party then. A friend of mine took me along. So it was very fortuitous as it worked out.
How long were you with your wife?
9 years, I think. We got married at the very end of '78, and I was coming out at the very beginning of '88. So that's 9 years. And then we spent the year of '88 going through the pregnancy and then making arrangements and plans to separate and divorce. My wife was, as my therapist put it, you married the right woman to divorce.
It went well.
Yeah, the marriage never went all that well, sort of for the obvious reasons. Although everybody who knew my wife also, she's a drama queen. So actually you would have thought my coming out would be not good. But no, to a drama person, this is great, because this is drama. So as I put it to people, what really hit her was, oh, this is a get out of marriage free card. Because, you know, I felt like things weren't right. And now I know it wasn't me, it was you. And not only that, but I can explain to everybody in just one word that it wasn't me, it was you. So she was perfectly happy and satisfied with the whole thing.
Wow. Where'd you meet her?
She was the daughter of a friend of mine. So we were hanging out doing some things and I met her. And the nice thing about a drama queen, when you are younger and don't recognize maybe a drama queen when you see one, is that they can be a lot of fun, because everything has got to be, you know, sort of whatever, happy-go-lucky, up in the air, try something new, blah-de-blah-de-blah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what a drama queen means to you?
Somebody who makes the most emotion out of whatever situation comes along. So if one is not well, oh my God, they may die. If there has been an accident, oh my God, it was horrible. But on the flip side, you know, if somebody's having a party, oh, this will be great, it's wonderful, you know, everybody's going to be there. Whatever it is, you just take it and you have to ramp everything up. Don't tell me, you're saying to yourself, am I a drama queen?
No. A little bit.
I should mention I'm somewhat temperamentally the opposite of a drama queen, so.
You moderate things and keep it level.
Which is probably part of the reason why I stay closeted so long. It's like, emotions? Yeah, you know, you can't trust those emotion things. You know, let's step back and look at the rational side of all this.
Okay, so your marriage was rough?
No, not. It wasn't great, but it wasn't rough, because you know, part of the reason I married her was we had some interests in common. We liked to travel around. We liked history. We were very focused on having kids, which we both kind of wanted to have, and there was infertility problems, so that gave a lot of focus on those things. So we were good when we were together. When you added other people in, that's when it became an issue, because my ex-wife could just go off on people in ways you would not believe. I'll give you one example. It almost made it that we didn't get married, because it was like the night or the night before the night that we got married, and friends of mine were coming in, and this was Rochester, at the end of December, Rochester, New York, at the end of December. It was winter, there was snow everywhere. And the friends that were coming in was my best friend who was going to be in the wedding party, and his wife did not like to fly, so they came by train. Well, train then is like train now, it's not terribly reliable, and it was supposed to get in around midnight. And so I was going to go down and meet them. They could come all that way, the least I could do is meet them. But my fiance at the time insisted upon coming along, and I was like, why? You know, stay home, get a good night's rest. But she insisted on it, so I was like, okay. And then the train was delayed, and it was delayed. And I think they finally got in like 5 a.m. And I could tell by the way that she was not talking or anything, she was furious about all of this. And so they got off the train, and they said their hellos or whatever, and they immediately sensed that, you know, she was not happy, and this first time they're meeting her. And so then they apologized for the delay and the lateness, like it's their fault. And as soon as they did, she went off on them. It's like, you're damn right you should apologize. You know, I forget the torrent that followed that, but it was like, you know, I was just horrified and appalled. So I don't know how we managed to drive them back to wherever, but when I got back to my ex-wife's home, her parents' home, they were still with us, and I excused myself as I saw her in. I went inside and basically told her that she was going back outside and apologized to them, or there was going to be no wedding. And she did do that, almost under protest, I think. But that can be the life of living with a drama queen.
It's intense. Okay. And so you were together with her for 9 years. You had 2 children. Can you tell me about your kids a little bit?
Oh, yeah, this is why it's good not to have expectations for your kids, because they both went in untraditional directions. My son, Christian, is on the autism spectrum, but he's very high functioning, and he lives here with us. He's now 36 years old. He'll be 37 this year, and he works for the Dauphin County Public Library, and being on the autism spectrum, you know, he doesn't socialize, so he doesn't have any friends. But he does have a big group of friends in the sense of his family, which he's networked well with. And he uses things like words with friends, and he plays like a half a dozen people that from the West Coast to the East Coast that are all family members and that. And he's gotten to know some of our friends and feels comfortable around them, so he has that whole social network. So he's doing pretty well, and he does well at work. And some, you know, part of the autism thing quite often is that you're a bit of an idiot savant. So it's like he absorbs tremendous amounts of information. When he was still riding in a car seat and we were driving somewhere, he recited the movie The Wizard of Oz verbatim from beginning to end. It took him an hour and a half. And you knew he was getting it right because I had seen it often enough in myself that I knew the lines and all that, and you could see him. He just went through it.
That's incredible.
And I used to do what I called pet child tricks, where, you know, we'd be at a dinner with somebody. He would be like 7, 8 years old. And I'd say to somebody, pick a number between 1 and 30. And I'd say, okay, now we'll look at that number 18, that's a president of the United States. Christian, what was the middle name of that president's second child? And he would give you the answer. I remember one time it was, what is Grover Cleveland's middle name? Which seemed kind of easy. But the answer was Grover. He didn't go by his first name, he went by his middle name. Things like that. So Christian's been an interesting ride because when we were first dealing with his issues when he was like 5, 6 years old, we didn't even recognize some of the other things. He cannot take crowds of people. So whenever he likes to eat, so when we go out to a restaurant, he's pulled between, well, I'd like to go to the restaurant and get something, but if there's a lot of people there, I mean, it literally drives him into a catatonic state practically. And he can get bad headaches and all. Well, if I look back on it, when he was an infant in a stroller, if I took him any place where there was a crowd, he would just start screaming and wailing and carrying on. As soon as you took him to the stroller and strolled back out of the crowd, he would be perfectly fine and happy again.
The kid doing its best to express itself, himself.
So there was a long, yeah, and I should have mentioned that. The year I was coming out, and probably was partly triggered by my coming out and the dissolution of the marriage and all, that's when he suddenly was having a lot of these issues, which we realized needed attention, so we were now going and seeing psychiatrists for him and all. So I had all of this stress on top of all the stress with work, on top of all the stress with coming out, with the divorce and everything else. And remember that checklist I talked about? Well, that's why it was so extensive. There was just an endless number of things going on that I was having to deal with. Now my daughter, on the other hand, sort of reminds me of the old thing about my wife and I had looked at our strengths and weaknesses, which really kind of like offset each other in some ways. Where I was very unemotional, she was overly emotional. Where I was very good in math. I have a math mind. She couldn't do anything mathematical, but she can do languages like there's no tomorrow. I can't do languages. I was lucky to get English down. And so we wondered, well, you know, if we had a kid who had all of our strengths, wouldn't that be something? On the other hand, we had a kid with all of our weaknesses, ooh. And it's sort of like my son got the short end of the stick and my daughter got the long end of the stick, so to speak. And so she was strong, outgoing, bright, capable, and continues to be so. She currently works for the Southern Poverty Law Center. She heads up their offices in New Orleans.
Nice.
And so she's very heavily engaged with all that.
What did she study?
Anthropology. I kind of let her take her own route. But
She understands people.
She minored in Spanish, and she's fluent in Spanish. And this is really what gave her her ticket to her jobs. When she first came out, she went into AmeriCorps, and she went up to New York City, and she worked in this big, huge health center in the Bronx, where she dealt with the poorest of the poor, with all their mental issues and all that kind of stuff. And she got a little burned out with that, so then she came down to Philadelphia and went to work for Pennsylvania Legal Services, and then from there she went down to the Southern Poverty Law Center. They recruited her. And in all those cases, the thing that really, although she was gaining some experience in some of these areas, the thing that always gave her the edge that they wanted her was her Spanish, because they needed people to be able to talk to people that spoke Spanish and not English.
Did she go to Penn State?
She did not. And I did not protest, although I came up with a formula for my kids, which may have been a little coercive, but I actually kind of liked the way it worked in the bigger scheme of things, which was I was going to give them a sum of money that was equal to the cost of tuition, room and board, and textbooks and everything else, all in at Penn State. But they didn't have to go to Penn State. They could go someplace cheaper and keep the difference, go to someplace more expensive, make up the difference, whatever the deal was, this is how much money you get, and then it's up to you. And so she took that deal and she went down to Bryn Mawr.
Either way, you paid for a Penn State education.
Exactly.
Did she like Bryn Mawr?
Yes, she really did. And we were surprised because she's a little bit like me in some sense. And when she went there, actually it's a lot like me, they were selling the old tradition of the school, these social rituals and all that they have. Well, this practically made her throw up. We were like, and you're choosing to go there? But there was something else about it, obviously, that she kind of, well, one of the things that she may have liked, knowing that she's a lesbian, was the fact that it's an all-girls school. So for whatever the reasons were, though, she decided that Bryn Mawr was for her. She went there. She had a good experience with it. She had a good education. She's made friends that seem to be lifelong friends. And so.
Awesome. Emmett, what's our time?
We're at 51 minutes.
Great.
Yeah. One thing I thought that would be nice is that story you told about getting married in the newspaper. That might be something else I say on tape.
Yeah.
You said right before we started.
Well, let's talk about Dan.
Yeah. If you, it's up to you, of course.
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
You had mentioned
The marriage announcement.
The marriage announcement.
Oh,
I thought that was a nice
yes.
story.
Yeah, you know, Dan and I met in 1990. The idea of getting married, at least to us, wasn't even on the table because you couldn't. There was no prospect of any time and anywhere in the near future that you would be able to. And you did have people who would have commitment ceremonies, but even those didn't seem to be that common. And it's like, well, how good are they? But then there's the lawyer part of me that comes in, where it's really like, yeah, what good are they? Do you understand that marriage is a legal contract that has actual, most people that get married, unfortunately, don't understand what a marriage is. They go into it with these very romantic notions of we're in love, we're going to love each other. And it's like, well, that has nothing to do with marriage. Because you can be in love and not be married, or you can be married and not in love. So, separate these two out from each other. Marriage is really a legally binding contract. And at one time, it was really a case of the father of the bride selling his daughter to this man because it was all, the women had no rights. You can even see it in the ceremony where who gives this woman to this man or whatever, and the father of the bride gives her to this guy. I mean, it's almost ludicrous when you get down to it. But it is binding. And what a lot of people don't realize, the old thing about let no man put asunder what God has put together or whatever, if you go back to like 1900 and you got engaged, it's like getting married today. You had made an offer and there had been an acceptance. You now had a contract. And if you backed out of that engagement without the consent of the other party, you could be sued for breach of contract. Now, fortunately, that went by the wayside somewhere over the decades, but then you bring it up to today, and actually back then, getting divorced was nigh on to impossible, because it was one thing for men to put an end to an engagement. It was quite another thing for men to put an end to marriage, because God had put that together, and that's where you got into this whole thing about religion and all that kind of stuff. But you move up into the modern era, the latter half of the 20th century, and suddenly, actually, marriage was more like engagement used to be. Now humans could do it if you weren't Catholic, and but at the same time, you have to unwind the contract of marriage, and you have to have consent on both sides. And I don't know how I got into that whole track, but I guess just to say, I have a very legalistic look at it. That's right. So we weren't thinking about marriage at all because it just wasn't there, and that's what marriage was to me, a legal thing, which I have. There's a lot of reasons to want to be married. If you're in love with somebody and it's a good relationship and you see it going on forever, there are hundreds and hundreds of reasons why you should be married. And I get a little bit short-tempered with people that I don't need the piece of paper kind of attitude, because it's like, yeah, well, wait till you go to the hospital and you try to say that you have rights to come in and make decisions about all of this. How's the hospital supposed to know whether or not you're a person who really should be allowed to make those kind of decisions or do whatever? You have to take a stand somewhere along the way, and both of you, that person saying to you and you saying to them, this is the person I'm choosing to share all these powers with. So all of that background, marriage was not something we were thinking about because it wasn't feasible or even thought about. Then marriage started, the gay rights community had sort of a split, because part of the gay rights community wanted to emphasize something we still do not have, which is equal rights vis-a-vis like jobs. You can still be legally fired for being gay. Not everywhere, but it's not a national thing. In most states you can. And Dan was fired for being gay, so we have very first-hand familiarity with all of that.
Who fired him?
He was working for an accountant on the West Shore, Don DeMuth. Dan was heading up the switchboard. There were a series of gay bashings at the gay bars in downtown Harrisburg. So a lot of the gays would not report it to the police because it would be outing them. And so the community got together and said, what are we going to do about this? Well, one of the things they concluded was they had to get people to report to the police. Well, while they're having this meeting, somebody had informed the media. So now there were all these reporters there that wanted to get a statement about all of this. Nobody at the meeting wanted to go out and speak to anybody because it would have been outing all of them. If you can imagine, I mean, this is now almost, this is about 30 years later, so very, very different time even then. Dan, though, was like, well, how can we sit here and be talking about people going to the police and reporting this when none of us are willing to step up and talk to the press about it? So Dan went out and talked to the press about it. And so then he was on television and in the papers, but his boss didn't notice any of this, and he went to work and everything seemed hunky-dory. His boss was extremely homophobic. His boss had a clause in a contract, an employment contract with Dan, that said he could be fired for being gay, specifically, and a damages clause put in there to boot. But a few days later, a client of theirs who happened to have seen Dan on television mentioned it to DeMuth, not in a demeaning sort of way, but just as a matter of fact. So DeMuth found out, and then he didn't fire Dan because Dan was working on stuff that was way too important. So he waited until all that work got done, and then he fired Dan. And then he didn't even bother to say what it was about. He said, you know what it's about. And Dan knew what it was about too, but he wouldn't say it. So Dan left, started his own practice, took like a third of the guy's clients. The guy, when he started losing his clients, then sent out a letter to all of the clients, saying, Dan, you should know that Dan is gay, and gays, of course, are subject to HIV, so you shouldn't hire him unless, of course, he can give you a medical certificate or whatever of good health and something to this effect. And so where was I going with all this? So that was our experience.
I've heard that name before, Dan Duluth, I think.
Don DeMuth, yeah. Don DeMuth. Yeah.
I heard something that sounded like Dan Duluth. So.
Yeah, Dan, well, actually, we had an article in the New Yorker at the time that it was sort of the cover article. It was written by James Stewart, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and author. There was a huge amount of interest from all the news shows on TV. We saw the 60 Minutes cruise on a number of occasions, although they never did anything because they couldn't get DeMuth to do anything. And so without having the good guy and the bad guy in it, it's where we got a little insight to the media world. They want a story.
They do mean a story.
Yes, exactly. So, so that was interesting. So, just a little more of the background.
So that was a big story.
Huge.
So to me, it seems like, of course, something like that happens, but it appears that other people thought it was a very high-profile unusual story.
Yes, and it was. And one of the weird things was is that Dan used, when his employer had given him this employment contract that said he could be fired for being gay, well, there are other provisions in there having to do with it as well. Employment contracts that forbid you to leave and take clients with you and all that to go into competition are not liked by the law because they're seen as anti-competitive, anti-market. But within a certain reason, they're allowed to give them, but you have to keep them very limited. Well, this guy had written one very broad, and of course the gay thing was sort of like a non-business thing anyways. Okay, you fire him and he's not allowed to go out and establish his business. And so Dan took this contract to these lawyers before he'd sign it, and they'd say, oh yeah, don't worry about it. He'd never be able to enforce that in court. Well, it went to court, and unfortunately, they didn't understand the blinding light of being gay, particularly back then, because that was still a very red-hot issue that nobody was used to dealing with. And it wasn't the jury. The jury was very sympathetic to Dan. They were going to find in his favor, because there were issues having to do with the fact that there was no current contract. The contract had a clause in it that said this contract expires at the end of the term thereof, which was 1 year, and will not be renewed. And there had not been a new one for a couple of years. But there are also things in the law that says, however, if the terms are continued to be, then it's understood that the parties are consider, both sides consider that it's ongoing or whatever. Well, so there's a lot of factual issues, and the factual issues go to the jury. But the judge in the case was like, oh my God, I can't let, and this is in Cumberland County, I can't let some new breaking ground in gay rights happen under my watch. So when the time came to give instructions to the jury, he turned to the jury and basically said, you basically have to go out and find for the plaintiff, his employer, who fired him. And this is what made it partly so interesting to people. Not only did you have an employer who admitted it in the filings for denying Dan unemployment benefits. He said it, I forget, in half a dozen other things. He said it in court. He said, I fired him because he's gay. Often you don't find that. Most people don't understand that you can fire somebody. Most people had the reaction of, well, you can't do that. And it's like, oh, yes, you can. It's perfectly legal. And on top of that, though, Dan didn't sue him. He sued Dan for damages. He fires him, and then he sues him. And it's like, it really twisted people's heads, and that's why the media loved this story, because it was just so bizarre to what everybody's expectations are. And then, of course, he won. So Dan basically lost everything he'd been working on for his whole life, and financially up to that point. And, but then there was the appeals. Well, the problem was is that he had used local attorneys who were good at contract law and all, but they weren't good at gay rights law. And they were caught with their pants down when they were asked to show. There's a provision that says that although there's no state protection, one cannot use the courts to enforce a private prejudice. And so even though there was no law against this, they were arguing that you can't use the courts here to enforce this man's private prejudice against gays. But the court wanted some evidence that the state considered being gay to be an issue, so to speak. Well, the biggest one was that the Schaap administration during the 70s had been very pro-gay and had a number of policies protecting gays and all this, so they could have shown that. But they didn't know that, and they had nothing to say at that. Lambda Legal got involved after the trial. And unfortunately then, Dan's lawyers had been kind of bad at all this stuff and didn't protect grounds for appeal, so they had a very limited area to go. And then once again, it came down to the judges. So you had 3 judges on appeals, and they were like really ridiculously conservative, moderate, and liberal. So the liberal got the whole thing and was like totally in agreement that this was an outrage of justice. The moderate finally reluctantly kind of went along that it wasn't, and then the conservative was just ranting and raving and foaming at the mouth up there. So it went on, the trial and then the appeal and all this went on for years. And it's interesting because in law schools now, Dan's case is trotted out as a part of the contracts and employment contracts and these broad clauses and all, as an example of sort of miscarriage of justice. The one exception to these things collapsing under their very broad provisions, because this guy had very, very broad provisions. In other words, it's not a case about gay rights. It's a case about contract law running amok. Because they recognize legally that this case should have collapsed right on the contractual provisions of it. It should never even gotten to the gay rights issues. And yet it did, because the gay rights issues just blinded them to get it all in
It seems
perspective.
that the gay rights issue actually propped up the failure of the contract law.
Yes, exactly. So all of this is coming out just about marriage, but at any rate, so Dan and I met in July of 1990. In October of 1990 was when this whole thing blew up and Dan's case came up. And of course, he was starting his own business. And at first, like anybody starting your business, it's like, am I going to have any business? So there was a lot of stress for a few months, and then he finally got himself started and all that. And then in February, because of the mergers and acquisitions and everything, I found myself out of work. So then
You were together at this point?
we were together, we were almost completely together by this point. I think I still had an apartment, but I was always at his place. So just in a matter of the first 6 months that we were together, we were going through all this kind of upheaval. It's sort of like, oh God, this is just more of my life. And then things started to settle down a little bit, but then this lawsuit came, and then I had gotten another job, and then I got into it's a long story, but I got into a conflict with the management at my new place, and then I was out of work again. And so then I found myself with my last employer, where things went very well for very long, which enabled me to retire very early, and that's a whole other story. But so the first several years of our being together were very chaotic, and they then became very, very work. Both of us worked a lot. He was working in the sense to reestablish all this money he had lost through his case and everything. I was working very much to reestablish my career after having lost 2 jobs in 3 years. And the kids were growing up, so we were all becoming like these typical middle-aged parents, where you're always running back and forth and doing this and that while you've got all this stress with work and everything.
You're at peak career, peak kids.
Yes, and so, like I said, marriage wasn't a thing. But then I was talking about how the gay rights community was started to go off. And around 2000, somewhere around there was a group that said, we should be fighting for the right to marry. The others were like, why would we be fighting for the right to marry when we still don't have the right to be employed, for God's sakes? In hindsight, I think the people who were fighting for the right to marry were right. First of all, because they got us the right to marriage. But second of all, because it helped change a whole perspective of the rest of the country. And that psychological angle, I don't think was appreciated by us pragmatists.
What do you think changed there? Like, what do you think was what was the magic bullet that marriage gave?
Well, I don't know if it was a magic bullet exactly, but prior to that, particularly gay men, they're all promiscuous. Well, you suddenly start trotting out people who want to get married. You're changing that whole perception. Instead of it being wild orgies every night or something that people are imagining in their heads or whatever, suddenly you're talking, and you saw them. You had all these stories about this couple that had been married for 40 years and raised these kids, or had just gotten married or were raising these kids, and the struggles they're going through, which is the same struggles that other married couples are going through. And suddenly the gays weren't all that much different than the straights were.
So the concept of gay marriage was destroying the stereotypes people held.
I think it was. And you can see these things after marriage came along, and it came along in stages, because you got domestic partnerships in some places, and then you got actual marriage, like in Massachusetts. And the fight against it was, as well, that was a court decision. The court shouldn't be making law. Well, then you would have a referendum go out, and the public would vote for it in some state, and then it would be like, well, they shouldn't be doing that. And then you'd have a legislature doing it, and well, well, who? Legislatures do it, the people do it, the courts do it. Exactly who is it that's not supposed to be doing this? So it just came along more and more and more and more, but along the way, because there was years that this went on. I don't remember where Massachusetts was, but I think it was probably about 6 years, 7, 8 years between the first domestic partnerships up to where it was federally found that there was no reason to not allow gays to marry, and we all got married. But all along the way, you just had this constant, for lack of a better word, propaganda campaign saying gays are people too. And that made a huge sea change. the AIDS epidemic was one that did it too. The difference was the AIDS epidemic suddenly made people aware that, oh my God, there are gay people. I mean, it isn't just this abstract notion that there are a few queer people over here. It's like movie stars, businessmen, all these people are gay because they would get AIDS and it would get out one way or the other, and people have to deal with it. But obviously AIDS wasn't creating the picture of, you know, the nice guy next door just like me. It was creating an image of, well, how did you get this disease? It was because you guys are all messing around all the time, and this is God's punishment on you, and now you're physically sick as well as mentally sick, and all that kind of stuff. But it did create the understanding that there were a lot of gay people. The marriage movement came around after, really, the drugs started dealing with the problem of AIDS, and now you've got the whole, they're people just like us kind of image being promoted. So I think that was like the follow-up act to the AIDS epidemic that got the public to finally start challenging their own preconceptions and prejudices and start accepting people as gay. But even then, when we were getting married, I'd run into these guys that I knew who married their partners of long years, and they would say, well, I refer to him as my spouse when they're talking to somebody in public. And I would always counter them and say, I never say that. I always say my husband. Because you're talking to somebody, they don't know you from Adam. First of all, if you say spouse, they're going to think that's a little strange. But if you say husband, they're going to know right from the get-go, oh, you're gay. And just that is making them kind of deal with the issue, and it's normalizing it to a certain extent, and it's a way of doing gay rights on a very small micro level. And most of them would accept that then and would start doing it, but you can see how long and in little ways all of those kinds of things have to change.
Did you see that a lot? People subtly hiding their sexuality?
Yeah, you know, people talk about coming out, but as anybody who's gay recognizes, there's coming out, and then there's coming out, and then there's coming out. It's like there's coming out to your friends, and then there's coming out to your family, and then there's coming out to your employer, and then it's coming out to all those strangers and people that you're dealing with in the public. There's all those levels you go through, and I think one of the most interesting ones is that it seems to me that a lot of people, the last one that they have a hardest time is just coming out in a very simple way to complete strangers that they just happen to be transacting business with, which is like the thing where you say something about my husband. Dan and I got married in 2012, which before Pennsylvania had marriage. And I was saying to Dan, I was not getting married until it was legal and meant something. But I changed my mind, and we went down to DC to get married. The reason I changed my mind is I went Comcast to exchange a piece of equipment that I needed to exchange. And I'm standing there in this ridiculously long line, and I'm reading this sign that says, we will not issue equipment to anybody except the person whose name is on the account and their spouse. And so I'm sitting in line, I pick up my phone, I call Dan, I say, my name better be on this account by the time I get to the front of this line. I got up there and I got a little pushback from somebody, and I pushed back on them, and they went back and got the supervisor out.
Were you married at this point?
No, we weren't.
You were not.
And brought it up, and I lied a bit. I said, we're married. Now, how many states do we have to be married in before Comcast recognizes that we're married? That put them on their heels, and they gave me the equipment. They were going to start a legal brouhaha over something like this. But then I went home to Dan and said, okay, we've got to get married. Because I had been thinking only about the government. I hadn't thought about all the other institutions in the world. And it's like, okay, so what if Pennsylvania doesn't recognize we're married and doesn't recognize it on our tax return, or the federal government still at that point didn't recognize we're married, and they don't recognize it on, there's these other businesses and places and institutions and all that it does make maybe a difference too. So we need to go out and get married and make it official. So that's when we got married. And that was very good thinking, because a couple of years later, the court acted. We were able to get, our marriage was recognized, and it saved us a ton in taxes.
Very practical reasons. You met Dan at a party, right? Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit more about meeting Dan?
Well, it was so quick. It was, because he came to the party with this much younger, blonde-headed kid, not too young, just younger than us. And I came with this other guy. I mean, we were dating. And then Dan felt like I was a bit annoying because I was paying so much attention to him. And to Dan.
To Dan.
And, but at the same time, he knew that I was interested in him, and apparently I must have made a good impression at some other level because he went into work the following Monday and was talking to the secretary there about meeting me because to her he could talk about this, not to his boss obviously, because before he was fired he was working for the homophobe. And then I was good enough to figure out where he worked. It was sort of like, now how do I track this guy down? Because I hadn't gotten his number, and this wasn't the day and age of cell phones yet even. But I knew he was an accountant, and I knew he worked in the West Shore, so I figured out where he worked. And I called him at work and made a date, and we met for lunch like that Tuesday. And in a sense, we've never been apart since. It was just one of those very quick things. But even though we got together very quickly, and after a few weeks, his friends were all like, well, how long is this going to last? And then even he was a little bit like, okay, the newness is coming off of this. How am I going to break up or whatever? But before he got around to that, suddenly he realized the attachment was growing deeper and broader. But for me, it was more like, well, this is a great guy and all that, but don't be too quick. Take your time. Maybe for the scars of the last several years, and kind of put that kind of caution into me. And so it was a slow coming together, I would say, throughout the 90s. It was like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We had the employment issues, the lawsuits, and all that kind of stuff. But by the time we got up to around 2000, we were going to a wedding in New Jersey. And Dan was like, we need to stay overnight when we go there because I don't want to like rush up and rush back. And I was like, why do we want to do that? And his vision of a wedding is someplace you get to go and you get to dance into the wee hours of the morning. And I'm like, is it even going to be that kind of wedding? So he got annoyed with me and he said, that's it, we're breaking up or whatever. And my retort back to him, and it wasn't quite this quick or easy, was, no, we're not. We're married, we're going to be married forever, get over it. And I think that clicked with him. It was like, oh, we're really in this committed relationship. This is great. And from that point on, there was never any looking back or questioning it or whatever. It was sort of like now the cement had cured.
So growing up, you didn't have any gay role models in your life?
Oh no, my God, no.
And
neither fictional nor real. There was nothing. Dan and I both talk about, here we are, completely separate lives, but we had very parallel ones. Like, we both know that in the 1968 presidential election, we stayed up late and we were following it all very, very carefully. He was 12. I was, well, he may have been 11 still. No, he would have been 12. And I was 14. You go a few years ahead, there was, I think it was Newsweek, put out a article on gays, just telling people, like, they exist, and this is what they're like, and this is where they live, or whatever. And they had it as a cover story. And Dan and I both remembered this vividly because it was like, oh my God, there's something that's actually talking about it. Because we had never, either one of us, had ever seen anything anywhere about the issue whatsoever in any way, shape, or form before that. So that gives you an idea just how much of a desert there was.
When you told me about the article, at first I was like gonna laugh, and then it really needed to be. Like, that article really needed to happen.
But at the same time, Dan and I were both like, we weren't getting news, we happened to see it like in a public place. We were afraid to touch it. That's how radioactive being gay was.
And you were 14.
Well, when that article came out, it was probably, that was later. It was like early 70s.
Okay.
So I was probably 20.
I have a question. Yeah, I just kind of, because you're talking about how you didn't have any role models, but then you had said earlier with your daughter that had, like, you were able to be a role model. So I don't know if you want to touch a little bit more on that, or like, did your daughter like live here, or?
No, they lived with their mother, but your typical kind of arrangement. They would come like every other weekend. But as they got a little bit older, now they're in high school, and some of her friends were maybe a year older, so some of them could drive. So they would come as a group for a weekend or whatever and spend time here. And yeah, I mean, just in ways big and small over a couple of years' time when we were having this, but then she moved on college and things kept changing. But we realized just how much these kids had still none of that. She was still in Altoona. When I left Altoona, my wife was still in Altoona. And, you know, it's the backwater. They didn't have any of that. And I mean, they talked to us about it, which was when we realized somewhat how much they liked being able to come here and seeing basically how normal we were.
Did you have any non-gay role models in mind going forward? Anyone that inspired you or directed the kind of marriage you wanted to have? Anything like that?
Non-gay role models. Not in terms of gay. I mean, I had lots of role models in terms of hardworking, honesty, courage, those sorts of things, but never anything about gay. Mm-hmm. Although some of those things feed right into it. You've got to be honest about it. You've got to have courage to stand up for who you are and what you believe in. So, I don't know how you want to spin that.
Just curious where that would go.
Yeah, my parents' friends were high-achieving people, and they were very honest, hardworking, and somewhat courageous people. And so those were the messages that I kept getting pounded into me as I was growing up. And you would have thought that I would put those things together sooner, but I didn't. Unfortunately, you know, I was focused on maybe the wrong things.
So tell me about your mother a bit.
My mother's still alive. She's 92. Thank God I have a role model that says I can live a long time. She's
Was she a stay-at-home mom?
Yes. When I was a child, every mother was a stay-at-home mom. Did I have a friend whose mother worked? That was high school. By the time I got to high school, I had a friend whose mother went back to work once the kids were old enough. And I was somewhat shocked. It's like, really? Your mother's working? It gives you another idea how much things have changed. Because I just really didn't. Now, State College was the kind of place where people made a fairly good income, so you didn't have it. And in that point in time, that was like 1971 or something, some of the economic pressures that have come to bear since on the middle class that kind of necessitate women to go back to work hadn't come into place either. But there were a lot of women who just weren't made to stay at home and be homemakers. They were, you know, they had ambitions and wanted to do things and all of that. So that's where you got into a lot of women who were somewhat unhappy being full-time homemakers. But my mother was not one of them. My mother was made to stay at home and be a housewife and a homemaker. Not that she was the greatest one in the world, but the house was competently managed in the sense that it was never cluttered. It was never particularly dirty. There was always food on the table, even if it wasn't all that well prepared. And parenting at that point in time, and my mother was part of that, was extremely laissez-faire. The concept of helicopter parents did not exist back then. We would go, I was in cross country and track, and in high school I would go to the meets. There were no parents there. You would have been embarrassed if your parents showed up, because teenagers were typically, at least back then, were embarrassed of their parents. So you didn't want them showing up at a meet. Why are they doing that? And the parents' attitude was, well, this is something you're doing. This is your thing. Why do I have to show up? What does it have to do with me? Nowadays, it's like all flip-flopped, where parents are like, oh, we've got to show support for little Johnny or Susie or whatever. We've got to show up at their events. And if they don't show up, the kids are like, oh, my God, my parents don't care about me. They're not here. I think this is all horrible. But things were very, very laissez-faire back then. We basically went Real small. You'd go out the door during, nice weather, and my mother literally would lock the door because she didn't want us running in and out all the time, and you'd stay out there and do your thing. You'd come home at lunch, you go back out again. They didn't know where you were or what you were doing, and they didn't worry about it. There wasn't the kind of concern like somebody might kidnap you or you might be in an accident or whatever. So we had incredibly free roaming ability. When I was 9 years old, I was taking my bike and going 10 miles from home. Nowadays, I think you could literally be arrested for allowing a child to do something like that, like child endangerment or something, which is just absurd, in my views.
So did you try to offer that to your kids, that freedom that you had?
I was very much a laissez-faire parent, and I had a number of things I would always tell them. And here's a bit of a gay theme, because 2 of the pieces of advice I always gave came out of the movie The Wizard of Oz. And they're at the very end with Glinda the Good Witch of the North. And one is that she tells Dorothy how the magic slippers will take her home again. And they were like, well, why didn't you tell her that? And Glinda says, because she wouldn't have believed me. She had to learn it for herself. And that is a huge thing. You as a parent want to teach your kids everything. But there are so many lessons in life, and probably the most important ones, that it's like some cruel trick. You have to learn them for yourself. It isn't that you don't believe your parents, but there's a combination of not believing, like, oh, times were different when you were growing up, they're different now, or, well, you just don't understand my situation, or you're just trying to make me feel better, whatever it is. There's some of that distancing, but there's also you may understand objectively what they're telling you, but unless you experience something, you don't really know what it's like until you've experienced it. And we all have that. And so I've always taken the position with my kids that, you're just going to have to learn these hard lessons yourself. And then I try to assure them that, we're here if they need anything. And I think they got that sense. One of the other things was in the movie is the part about Dorothy at the very end saying that when she's asked, what have you learned? She's learned that if she ever goes looking for her own heart's desire again, she'll look no further than her own backyard, because if it isn't there, she hasn't lost it because she never really had it at all. And this is trying to figure out who you are, what you can do, and what you can be good at. And this is the thing that you have to learn in life. And so that was one of the other lessons I would give them, but it was tied right to you're going to have to learn that yourself. I can throw in a suggestion here and there along the way, but these are all things that you have to learn yourself.
So I'm trying to figure out that last one. I'm thinking it's like, if you don't already have near you what it is that you love, then you need to go somewhere else?
No, it's quite the contrary. It isn't there. You're looking for the wrong thing. You'll find people, I've seen, being older maybe, I've seen a lot more of this maybe than you have, but people who just don't know what they want to do, where they want to go, who they want to be with. In some ways I feel badly for them. And then there's other people that's like, oh my God, I want to do this, and this, and I don't know which one to go first, so I'll go work on this for a while, but if anything goes wrong there, I'll jump over and do this or whatever. And in between you have this big group of people who kind of go along and they get involved in this or that, but eventually they work out what they're good at. And that's the other part of it. And growing up, you have to find that nexus between things that really interest you and things that you can do, that you're good at. And that's the huge exploration in your life in many respects, whether it's relationships or jobs or hobbies or pastimes or passions or whatever, is finding those things. And when I was growing up, they had the expression that you heard a lot of like the hippies and that age group talking about finding themselves. Well, I didn't understand that then. I always thought they sounded way too self-absorbed, which to a certain extent they were. But now, much later in life, I appreciate very much that kids need to find themselves. But I don't know if necessarily the hippie way, but that is, learning who you are, figuring out your identity, and finding out those things that you're good at and that you're interested in. So I'm very much a laissez-faire parent, but that's kind of the advice I give. To the point at one point where one of my my daughter's friend said to me, yes, she mocks you every now and then. She says, if I told my father I was raped, he would probably tell me that that was just a good life learning experience. I'm like, okay, maybe I'm going a little too far here.
It seems like a powerful philosophy, though. It's cool. I had a thought. So, how did your kids take to that laissez-faire style, as you put it?
You know, I don't know if you can ever ask a parent that. My father died from a cancer, and my parents kind of like kept a lot of this from us. At first, I think they kept the diagnosis of cancer away from us, and then when they gave it to us, they always gave us the rosy upside of treatment and all of that. So it was like 2 weeks before he died that I was like, oh my God, he could die. And in the earlier phases, though, he was coming around, he was asking us to sort of grade him on how good a parent he had been. Mm-hmm. And and I found it a very difficult thing to even answer. And I don't know if it was right then or shortly thereafter. It was like, well, am I grading you on the absolute or am I grading you on the curve? Because I would grade my parents both extremely well on the curve, compared to other parents. Not that the parents of my friends and all that were all that bad, but my parents were pretty darn good. But if I was to grade my parents on the absolute, it was like, whoa, you people should have recognized I was gay and helped me deal with this, and and everything else you're pretty good, but this was like a big thing. So, and looking at how my father kind of forced me into looking and grading him, if I now turn and look to try to grade myself, it's like, damn, that's even harder to do than I think grading my parents. Something you'd have to ask my kids, and then they probably have a hard time telling. I think I must have done okay because I'm close to my kids, and they come to me and to Dan for advice. And it's interesting, too, to watch when they go to me and when they go to Dan. Not that I've ever really been able to dissect it out, but there's definitely patterns there where they go to one or the other, depending on what it is.
What kind of patterns do you see?
I can't articulate that right yet.
Okay.
I think if it's like doing something adventurous, they're going to Dan. If it's like the practical things like buying a new car, how do I do that? What should I consider? Then they come to me.
Is Dan adventurous?
Oh my God, is he adventurous? Let's see. In July of 16, we spent several weeks touring Europe. Came back from there. I had lunch with a friend who talked about this group of his that were going hiking in the Himalayas. I told him how Dan would always like to do that. So Dan ended up jumping into this trip at the last minute and going off and trekking through the Himalayas. He came home from that and really liked this whole idea, but he really wanted me to be along. And the reason I didn't go along was because of the accommodations. I said, I don't mind the trekking, but at the end of the day, I need a nice bed and a bathroom and hot and cold running water. They didn't even have running water at these places. You basically have these cots, like 5 of them in a room that's 10 by 10, that you're sharing with whoever. And he went into one where when he stepped into the room, its rat jumped off of it. We're talking about very, very basic accommodations in the Himalayas. So I kind of challenged him to find hikes. So then just a few months after that, in May of 17, we went to, it was May of 18. So it must have been 17 and then 18. We went to Wales and we hiked the coast, which was about 200 miles. But there, I was whining and complaining because we actually had to stay at some youth hostels, although we had private rooms, but I had to share a bathroom. It's like, oh my God, I have to get up in the middle of the night and go to a shared bathroom. But there was fortunately nobody else really in the place, so it was more like a private bath. And now, this May, we're going back to England and we're going to hike from the coast to coast, where you go from one side of England to the other. And then after that, he's going to Spain in September to do the El Camino de Santiago pilgrimage, which is a 500-mile walk that people do. And this one I'm staying home from too, because in this one you just walk, and when you're done at the end of the day, you stop and you find accommodation. whatever it may be. Well, this has become a very popular thing. So you may be sharing a big gymnasium-like space with 500 of your unknown friends. And they talk about things like the bed bugs and how you have to have your earplugs to drown out all the snoring. And it's like, this is not my idea of a good time, but it is Dan's, so off he goes.
Is Dan retired?
No.
No?
Dan is the city treasurer, plus he's the founder of his own practice, which he started when he got fired by Demuth, Miller Dixon Drake, which has 4 CPAs counting him, plus their office manager, and they're all very busy because it's tax season, and because it's tax season, I actually help him with that. I've been retired for 12 years, and he's like, I don't want to retire, because to him it's all fun.
You've been retired 12 years.
Yeah, I told you. After I got fired the second time, I got out of the banks.
Yeah.
And I'm almost embarrassed to say to most people, but it's sort of like I got more into the Wall Street gravy train. So Wall Street was very good to me, although not sinfully so, but I saw that side of it. And I will tell anybody Wall Street is out of control and they've got to do something about it because they're just skimming off the wealth of the country. It's just horrible. You see people making $500,000 a year who feel that they are terribly abused because they're not making the $1.5 million the guy next to them is making, and after all, they work harder than they do. And you have to kind of like slap them across the face and say, do you think somebody scrubbing floors every day for a living isn't working hard? And they don't get paid anything.
Talk about keeping up with the Joneses.
Yes. People, they don't look down so much as they look up. And if you get into certain environments, I have a friend who worked on Wall Street, and 20 years ago, he retired from there because he was only in his 40s because it had been that good to him. And a couple of years after he retired, they came back to him and they were offering him basically like $2.5 million a year to come back to work. And he said no, for a number of reasons. One, because he says, that might sound like a lot of money, but New York's expensive, and you have your place in the city, and then you have to get your place out in the Hamptons. But he wasn't going to get sucked into that. He just had a nice little townhouse in Washington, and his wife had an issue with a brain tumor. And at this point, it was in remission, but they said if it ever comes back, that's it. And he says, I'm not going to go back into that to make more money that I don't need, and then have something happen to her and wasted all that time. And in the long run, he was absolutely right, because eventually it did come back and she did die quite prematurely. So he was very happy that he made the decision he did. And are you familiar with Vanguard?
Yes. Yeah, it's like a
Mutual
retirement.
fund, it's a mutual fund company, and you may think of a retirement because people have IRAs there and retirement plans are there, and it's huge. It holds a few trillion in assets now. Well, back in the 70s, it was founded by John Bolger. And Vanguard, by the way, is down in Philadelphia, and it's right in the area where I lived and worked and all of that. And I've worked with a lot of people that had work there, and I'm very familiar with the company. I put all my money there and all this kind of stuff. And the reason is because of John Bolger. Well, John Bolger had gone to this hedge fund manager's home out on Long Island, I think it was. And it was the kind of place that they had quipped about John D. Rockefeller's estate, that it's the kind of place God would have had if God would have had Rockefeller's money. Well, it was sort of the same thing with this hedge fund manager. It was just, Versailles done right. And John Bogle said to this other guy that was there, he said, there's one thing I've got that this guy will never have. Enough. Mm. And that's a lesson that I find a lot of Wall Streeters just don't get. I don't know what game they're caught up in.
Wow. You found enough.
Oh, yeah.
It's great that you got to take part in it, at least somewhat, and to be able to retire.
And I wouldn't have retired except that Dan was here and work was taking me down to Philadelphia. So we had a lot of separation.
How long did you work in Philly?
12 years.
That was your main job there at
Yeah.
the end.
And I liked the work and I liked the people I was working with. But when I decided to step out too, remember I had been fired twice before, I had learned the lesson that you should leave them wanting more. So without meaning to pound my chest, I was very well respected and regarded there, held in very high esteem, and for very practical reasons why I did, but I won't go into all that. And I thought, this is the time to go. Little did I know that I was finally listening to my inner self and listening to good advice. Because what happened when I left is I sold my condo for like 2.5 times what I paid for it because I was at the top of the housing bubble. I had to cash in all my options because you can't keep them once you leave. And it was right before the great crash of 2008, which would have wiped out all the value. So the end of the upshot is by leaving early, I made much more money than I would have ever made if I would have stayed. And when the great crash came, it being in the financial sector, the bloodletting was unrelentless. So I don't know, but I could have lost my job even then, which would have left me even more impoverished. Not that I would have been impoverished, but...
What a dodge.
But by listening and saying, this is enough, it's time to go, I came out great. And that's something else I think you really have to learn over life. It's the right moment to make changes. And it's not something you can sit down with and you do your pros and cons. It's just, I think you learn from experience and you start to get a sense of, this seems right. And you start to lose some of your fears about, yeah, but what's next? You start saying, this has run its course, this has been a good thing, and this is time to let go.
You mentioned Dan was working with Switchboard.
Yeah.
Right? Can you talk about his involvement with that? Your involvement with it?
I had very little. It's all him. He came back to Harrisburg in like '86. He kind of smartly took his career and he kind of flopped around. He worked for Taylor Wines up in New York for a while, and then he went out to Kalamazoo, Michigan for whatever reason, but it didn't last very long there, and then got a job at Hilton Head, South Carolina, and was working there. And then he decided he needed to come out and whatever, and however that tied into it, I can't tell you. He came home to Harrisburg and he got the accounting job over there. And then he was doing things like he became involved in the Switchboard. He became the chairman or whatever, the Switchboard president. Are you familiar with the Switchboard? Oh, the history project you probably would be anyways. It's sort of like technology took care of all that. But the Switchboard was like when you had nobody, no way to connect with anything, they came up with the idea of having someplace you could call and get some connection. And it was like on its death throes, I guess, and Dan and then Barry got it back on his feet and very healthy. From there they went and established the Gay Pride Festival, which still goes on. And from that they went and established Bagel, which then became the Gay Chamber of Commerce. So those were like the things they did. And then around the mid to late 90s, they both stepped back away from all that stuff. They just kind of burned out. Been there, done that, and that kind of thing, and didn't get that involved until then Dan decided to start running for public office because he thought, well, this is what gay people should be doing now. They should be running for public office as openly gay people.
So it seems like your relationship with Dan has brought you into more public spaces than you would have otherwise been. How has that been for you?
I'm fine with that. I don't want to be the one standing at the podium making the speech, but I don't mind having the glare of the public on me at all. It's like, if your people are interested.
What did Dan do for the Switchboard? Was he the treasurer for that as well?
No, he was the president.
The president. Okay.
I can't remember what the title was, but it's the head honcho.
Okay.
The top guy, the big dog.
Right. So what was Harrisburg like? What was it like being gay in Harrisburg throughout your relationship?
Not much different than it is right now.
Yeah.
I talked about his firing on being tied to the gay bashings, but I never felt any of that kind of threat. Then again, I didn't really go to the gay bars much. When I was in college and I became 21, I went out to the bars some. And I quickly decided I did not like bars. And particularly then, there was smoke as well as alcohol, and it's like, I don't like beer. And I don't particularly care for dancing. Nothing about the places appealed to me. Then the decades rolled forward a little bit, and I'm coming out and I'm figuring, well, the place you need to go meet people is gay bars. So I went back to the gay bars a little bit, and it was like, hold it, these are still bars. These are the places I don't really care for all that much. So once Dan and I were together, it's like I was almost never going to them anyways. In fact, I don't know, once, twice in the last 30 years. So to a large extent, it's like the same group of people that's grown. It's evolved over the time, but from my perspective, the last 30 years have been sort of just an evolution of the very same and very little change. It's changed more than I realized probably, but pretty much the same.
Have you ever faced discrimination for being gay?
I'd have to say no. I was pretty open when I was employed. As I mentioned, that one employer, after my first firing I went to, I had just been on the front page of the paper, so everybody there knew, even though I didn't know they all knew. Although I had kind of played a little trick, because I had learned that the guy that headed up that division that I went to work for, who was part of the hiring of me, was gay. And he didn't even know that I knew he was gay. But I sent him a letter when I was applying for the position. It was kind of cryptic. It said something about that I had met him previously and knew him from something, but I didn't really say what. And I just knew that this was going to catch his interest, like, who is this person? and that part worked. And I had been truthful, but it had been a professional conference or whatever. And but then we got to know each other over a period of time. Obviously since I was working there. And we only got together socially on one occasion, and then I explained to him that everybody there knew that he was gay, which was news to him. And we covered a lot of ground. And then the next employer I went to, after that bank got gobbled up and everything, I was out to dinner with people I remember, and one of the people there was very forward. I liked her, but she was very forward. And so she said, well, why did you get divorced? And I said, well, because I'm gay. And I remember this one guy afterwards said, when you said that, I almost choked on my food. But yeah, nobody had any issues with it. Usually the circles I was working in, I think, were, without even maybe realizing it, were very pro-gay. It's sort of like, well, you're either gay or you're not. Why do people make such a fuss about all of this? But that's the financial world. They may be greedy bastards, always looking to make a hell of a lot more money. But they also tend to be rather not prejudiced, and they don't want to be. If you can make them a lot more money, great. If you can't, well, they're not interested.
Unlike accounting, apparently.
Well, that's his boss. There's a screw loose there somewhere. This guy does not really know how to interact with people. So I wouldn't put that on the blame of the accounting practice, although I would say they're probably not as enlightening as the financial world, but they're kind of stodgy conservative types, unlike my husband, but which is one of the reasons why I think he has two young CPAs that work for them, who are sort of like they're grooming them as the next generation. And they all like working there, I think, because it's a very free, unoppressive environment, which is the way that Dan has created it to be. He knew, like coming up, that there was, accountants particularly have this, we're going to work you to death. That's what you have to do to earn your whatever. And a number of professions have that. And it's like the medical profession when doctors go and they have to do their internships and they have them work those ridiculous like 24-hour shifts and all of that. Who wants some totally exhausted person working on you? So the accounting profession has a bit of that, but Dan never liked it.
It seems like he has made an environment where people can grow.
where they can be themselves,
Be themselves.
which means you can grow.
Do you think that's a prerequisite to growth, being yourself?
Yes. You can grow to an extent without it, but you're going to hit a ceiling or a wall somewhere along the way.
So therefore, as people grow, they will be more interested in being themselves?
Well, hopefully they'll learn who themselves are, and you're always more interested in being yourself if you know what it is.
Cool. So Dan's adventurous. What sort of adventures do you do around here? What have you done around here? Or do you always travel for adventures?
Well, I usually avoid the most adventuresome stuff. Like he was doing paragliding, you know, where you jump off like a 10,000-foot cliff somewhere, and he didn't do it by himself. It's what do they call it? Tandem. So you have a guy who knows what they're doing. But you wouldn't get me jumping off a 10,000-foot cliff.
I get an anxiety just thinking about it.
So yes, he has that adventuresome side. He likes to think of himself as a risk taker. I explained to him that he's not a risk taker. He doesn't think there is any risk. He's an optimist. Everything's going to be great.
So he's just misunderstanding the situation or perceiving it differently.
He sees no downside. It's all upside. So, and he's very good about letting go of anything in the past. So, like when he went and talked to the press about gay bashing and that got him fired, well, he didn't think he would get fired. And then when he got fired, he let go of that. And then when he got sued, well, that upset him, but once that was over, he let go of that. And he just keeps moving forward very much, and he doesn't look back at a lot of these things. And when he does look back at it, he sees it all as growth. You learn things, and you grow, and you evolve, and you move on. And it all freed him to be himself and to do what he wanted to do the way he wanted to do it.
You both seem like growth-oriented people.
And we're not like, we want to grow. We're like, we want to do this, we want to do that, and you find that, oh, they're learning, expanding, growing experiences. But it's not like, oh, we want to grow. It's just that our interests, our inclinations, our drive, or whatever, take us in that direction.
If I could go back to the gay bashings just real quick. What was, I didn't ask what that was about. I haven't heard of it.
That was, people who have issues and want to take it out on somebody else, so they think, hey, let's go beat up some gays.
It was just a random violent event.
And I don't know whether there was a particular group that was doing it or it was just different people. Dan himself was gay bashed, not badly, but he and a friend right there in the same section, but this was after.
What section?
Do you know where Stallions is?
Yeah.
It's right there, in that neighborhood. Because you go in like the Stallions in the back or whatever, and there were a number of other gay bars right in that area, and that's where the people kind of said, oh, that's where the gays are, so if you want to beat one up, that's where you go. And Dan and a friend came out one evening, so it was dark, and they're walking along the sidewalk just a block down from Stallions, right behind it, so to speak, and they noticed these young guys over here, but you kind of notice them, but you don't think, oh, they're going to beat me up, and then suddenly, it's like before he knew it, this one just came up right into his face and punched him in the eye. It kind of threw him, and his friend then kind of like being thrown for it, kind of like backed up a little bit like into the street and trying to put some distance between himself and these guys. And then these guys probably now having hit somebody, maybe realizing, hey, we don't want to be caught here, kind of skedaddled off. So it was all very much a hit and run kind of situation.
So that was when Dan was hit. Was it the same kind of thing was that the gay bashing event that he was talking to the press about?
No, because he was talking to the press maybe 1 or 2 years before this even happened. And I think some of the incidents that had happened then were a bit more serious, where people had been, Dan just had maybe a bit of a black eye, but were more seriously injured.
There's a number of people.
Yeah, and if it had been one event, I don't think the community would have gotten together or worried about it. It was just an isolated incident, but there had been a string of them within a fairly short period of time, and so it was like, there's a problem here, and we need more police presence in that area, so we need to talk to the government and get them to pay attention to this as a real issue, but before they'll recognize it, we need people to go and report it to the police, otherwise the police are going to go, what gay bashing? We have no reports of any gay bashing. And so that's where you have to start at the bottom. And I had a thought along here, but I've lost it.
Just so you know, we got only 10 minutes left on the sleep card.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Dan was the one that kind of took that first public hit, reporting the stuff to the police.
Well, he went and talked to the press, and that
Press.
got him fired. So in that kind of way, he got a hit. But it was a couple years later before he actually got a fist in the face.
Oh yeah, I didn't mean.
So yes, it all
Literal.
depends what you mean by hit. Yeah, Dan only cost him like $200,000.
He lost that much money. That's unbelievable.
It was a lot more money back then.
That's just evil.
Now you know why the press was also intrigued.
Right. Amazing. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about?
No, but I hadn't had anything to talk about when you came, so.
I think you had a lot of interesting things to talk about.
Well, thank you.
Is there any historical documents or photos that you'd like to share with the center?
I do not have anything because of all the stuff we have, you already have it.
Okay.
Because they went through Dan first.
Well, you say you have a connection to Barry that's quite close, so.
Well, lunch every day. For 30 years or.
All right. I think we'll end it there.
Okay.
Thank you very much for participating.
You're welcome.
Really
Thank you for
appreciate it.
coming out
Yeah.
and for working on this project.